this is a short working definition for moral injury. It comes in the wake of high stakes situations in which things go very wrong and harm results. So the first place this was studied was, of course, in war with veterans of war, but there are many other places where moral injury can occur. Anyone who has a moral conscience is susceptible to it. It can emerge in those who do the wrong, those who are harmed by those they trust, who have power or authority. So it can be something that is done wrong to you, not just something wrong that you might have done. It can affect those who are witnesses to that harm. This is what you might call bystander effect. And it can affect those who have an emotional investment in an event and hear about the harm. So it can come from many different ways. I actually know people who never actually had to do something, but just even getting ready and imagining having to do something pretty devastating has affected them deeply. So it's serious, and it disrupts our love and meaning systems. So as human beings, love is crucial to survival and to being a decent person and having a sense of our own humanity. So to have that disrupted is a major break. What are some of the signs of moral injury? So some of the social issues you may notice if someone has it is that they may be isolating, not wanting to socialize or be with other people. They may have a lot of aggression, even a toxic kind of anger that they're not able to control, or they may be misusing substances to control the pain. Or they may feel unsafe all the time. They may just anxious and even hypervigilant sometimes. They lack trust. They mistrust themselves and other people. They will often be suspicious of others' motives or behaviors. And they're not able really to engage in intimate relationships because their capacity to trust is so impaired, and you have to have that to have good relationships. The spiritual challenges of moral injury include loss of faith. You can imagine how it might feel if you're in a really terrible situation and you really believe that your faith is powerful and that if you pray, the worst thing won't happen, and then the worst thing happens. And a loss of faith may be that you stop believing in God at all, or it may be that you're just so angry at God you don't want to have a relationship with your previous tradition. You may also give up on ordinary relationships. We all know that something devastating that it happens within a relationship, even if it's not something that the two people did to each other, if it's an external event like the loss of a child or something like that, it can really disrupt a relationship if it's not healed. And moral injury shows up often in high divorce rates in people who experience it, or them just not connecting anymore to people they previously related to. It can also mean people lose that kind of personal discipline and structure that they have in their lives, that they don't like authority, don't like structures, resentful of it, or themselves just give up all the personal disciplines they used to have. Existential issues include fatalism, despair, and another sign of it is important is unrelenting grief, sorrow that just doesn't have comfort in it at all. The self becomes a negative thing. People will sometimes say, I became evil, or I have an evil thing inside me. They may loathe themselves, really hate themselves, or say things like, I don't know who I am anymore, but who I was just isn't here. And they may get so severe in their moral injury that they contemplate taking their lives because they just don't feel like they deserve to live anymore. Next slide, please. So there's some main points about moral injury I think it's important to remember. And the first one is one that is a little bit surprising for me to have come to, not because I don't believe it, but because generally psychologists, psychiatrists, and social scientists tend to avoid making existential or essentialist claims about human beings, about human nature. That's sort of the job of theologians. And as a theologian, I sort of do that sometimes, but I've been surprised in my work with so many psychiatrists and psychologists that their work in moral injury is leading them to conclude that we are all born moral, because it's essential to being loved, and we don't survive without love from the moment we're born. And I actually agree with them. I do believe that human beings are born moral, which is why moral injury is such a serious personal crisis and a collective crisis. It's not just something that can happen to one individual. It can happen to whole groups of people. So it's really important to remember we are born moral. And moral injury, therefore, is also not a disorder. It's a risk of the human condition and human frailty, but it results in a sort of war inside that is anguishing, and it comes from that moral place in us, our humanity, that is now fighting with our experiences that devastated us. It's we call it the war inside, because the experiences that cause moral injury, that have led to the moral injury, can't be integrated. They just sort of take over and haunt people, and they just are sitting there, and a conscience can't make sense of it, can't integrate it into a moral meaning system that makes sense of life. So alleviating that suffering, alleviating the moral anguish of moral injury, requires us to actually reconstruct our humanity. And part of that is that because the moral injury trauma has taken over a sense of self, it tends to blot out a narrative of life that can remember any goodness before it happened. So part of the task of alleviating the suffering is helping people reconstruct a life narrative where the moral injury isn't the only defining thing about that life. And that's the process that begins a way to create a sense of meaning and purpose that will make sense of our lives. So reconstructing our humanity is how we recover from moral injury, but that reconstruction can't ignore the moral injury. It can't just say, okay, well, that's in the past now and we can move on. You don't really move on from it. It's never going to be forgotten. It may still cause pain in your life every time you think about it, but instead of being the biggest factor in your life that defines who you are, it becomes a piece of information for understanding who we are and developing a greater sense of wisdom and integrity from having reflected upon it in a deep way. And that kind of reflection takes a very long time. It's not a simple process. It isn't, well, okay, now I'm going to sit down and write about it and think about it, and it will be over.